Could the great mystery that unifies all that we know about science and the great secret of the spiritual traditions that allows us to influence the world around us through something we do inside of our bodies, could they be related? Or we can take it one step further, are they the same force? Western science and ancient spiritual traditions were in fact describing precisely the same form of energy, the same force, using very, very different languages for the same applications. For most of my adult life, I've had a sense that somewhere in the midst of our ancient memory, we were left a clue to help us understand who we are as individuals, who we are as a species, and with that clue, a reason to look beyond the beliefs that may have separated us in the past and lead us into an era of peace, cooperation, hope, and possibility. From ancient temples and tombs, buried underneath centuries of sand and debris, to fragmented texts and monasteries in the mountains of Egypt and the high deserts of Peru, the American desert Southwest, for nearly 2 decades, my search has continued, and it's in these places that the ancients found themselves on a very similar search. Well, it's in these places as well that our ancestors left clues to a lost knowledge for those who would follow in their footsteps. If we have the wisdom to recognize their gifts, and we can find within ourselves the courage to honor the legacy of their search, we may find that the answers to our greatest mysteries are closer than we think. This program is a story of my search for precisely such clues. Through a blend of true life stories, leading-edge science, ancient texts, and direct experience, over the next few hours, together we'll develop the concepts and the applications, the literal instructions for a timeless wisdom that was left to us by those who have laid the foundation of our world today. Through their understanding, we are given new meaning to each moment and every day of our lives. So I invite you to join me on a journey. This is a journey of exploration, discovery, mystery, and insight. It leads us to the powerful wisdom of the ancients and to the knowledge of what they call the most powerful force, the single most powerful force in the universe. It's a force that lives within every one of us. And with that knowledge, we find the empowering message of hope and possibility that lives within us as well today. So I'd like to begin with a story that came to me a number of years ago. And I can't really even remember who it was that shared this story or where it came from. What I do remember is that it moved me so deeply, it brought me to tears the very first time I heard this story. And it also helped me to understand the concept of the field of energy that links all of creation in the traditions of the ancients and the implications of that concept. It's a true story of a young Jewish boy and his father in the 20th century. And as the Jewish boy was coming of age, he began to question the traditions that he had been raised in, and what they meant to him and the validity of those traditions. And his father took the questioning very personally and was offended by the questioning. And the boy said to his father, I understand I've been raised in these traditions. He said, but I need to go out into the world and find if these traditions really hold true for me in my life. I have to see these things for myself. And the father said to him, if you turn your back on the traditions that we have raised you within, and if you turn your back on me, I have no son, you're no longer my son. And the boy said, I'm sorry, Father, this is what I have to do. And he did, and he left the United States, and he began to tour the world, and he went into Europe just to find out what the world was like and how his teachings would serve him in his interactions with other people. Years went by, he and his father had absolutely no contact at all. He met a girl, and they settled down, and he was living a happy life in urban society. And one day, into the cafe where they were having their coffee, a friend of his walked in from America that he had not seen since he left. And they were very happy to see one another. And the first thing that his friend said to him, to the boy, he says, I'm so sorry to hear about the death of your father. And this is the first time the young boy had heard that his father had died. And he immediately came back to the States. And he began speaking to the people in the neighborhood and to their friends and to the family regarding his relationship with his father. And what he discovered very quickly was that his father, in fact, had never forgotten him at all. That his father had spoke of his son incessantly and how proud he was of his son, the strength and the courage that he had to go into the world and find his own way. And it brought the young boy back into the roots of his Hebrew traditions, the Jewish faith. And he says, I'm going to go to the place where this belief system began, to where it all originated. He found himself in Jerusalem, and he went to a place where people perform their prayers on a daily basis. It's called the Wailing Wall, or the West Wall. And it's a fascinating wall, very ancient stone blocks with mortar that has held them together for many, many centuries. And the wall is so ancient that the mortar has begun to fall out in certain places. And in place of where the mortar has been, there are little tiny pieces of paper and scraps of cloth that are rolled up and stuffed into all of the little crevices and the nooks and crannies. And on each one of those pieces of cloth or paper is a prayer that someone has inscribed and placed. And the tradition that brought him back to where his roots had begun, the boy also inscribed a prayer honoring his relationship with his father. And as he scanned the wall with his eyes, searching for just the right place where he could leave his prayer to honor his relationship with his father, all of a sudden, a prayer that someone else had placed in an earlier time dropped out at his feet. And he bent down to pick this up to replace it in the wall, and as he did, he happened to notice some of the writing on the prayer, and it was the writing of his father. And he opened the prayer, and what he found was that before his death, his father had journeyed to precisely the same place and had left a prayer giving thanks for his relationship with his son and the beauty that his son brought into his life. And in that moment, the boy was brought back to his roots and to the understanding that even though his father perhaps is no longer in this world, there was still that link, there was still a communication that had occurred between them. And when I hear stories like this, while I'm not surprised, I'm always in awe. I'm in awe of the process because it tells me two things. First of all, when I share this story with others, within myself, even though I've shared it many, many times, it creates a feeling in my body. And perhaps you had that feeling as well when you heard me describe how he looked at his father's handwriting and the synchronicity of seeing that on that prayer, a little piece of paper. And in that feeling lives a power. And it's a power that we are only beginning to understand here in the West. It's a power that transcends what we think of in our minds. It is the power of human emotion and human feeling that can only come about from a genuine experience of emotion in our hearts rather than the logic of our minds. So I'm sharing this story now to begin our program, hopefully to share with you, the listener, an idea perhaps of what that feeling is all about. Choices that we're making in our time, our generation, the choices that we make in terms of technology and religion, in terms of science, in medicine, for the first time in recorded human history, these choices carry consequences that we cannot undo. Always in the past, if a generation made a choice that did not serve them well, they would simply say, well, we won't do that again. We can no longer do that. When we talk about changing the genetic code of a species, when we speak about the implications of nuclear technologies, the evolution of our bodies, the DNA in our bodies, for example, it has taken hundreds and thousands of years for us to arrive at what is called the genetic recipe that allows us to work however well we believe we work in our world. What are the implications if we, in one generation, intercede and change that genetic recipe in response to a single threat? For example, there is a proposal that we change our genetic code to make us immune to the anthrax virus because it appears to be a threat in this generation right now. And I believe we can probably do this. However, what are the long-term implications? Do we really know what it means to us if 30 years from now another virus comes into our populations? By making that change now, have we somehow compromised the wisdom and the intelligence of our body to take care of us in another generation? And the truth is, the best scientists of our time will tell us we really don't know the answer to that. We really don't know. The evolution of our bodies, the stability of nations, the peace of our world literally hang in the balance of the choices that we're making in the single generation, keys to our very survival right now. So we can say, without exaggeration, that for the first time in recorded human history, we have at our fingertips the power to preserve or to destroy all that we cherish as a species. And that is an awesome, awesome power for us to have. And there's a tremendous responsibility that comes with us understanding that kind of power. The great irony of our time in history is that in the presence of such power that gives us what appear to be miraculous technologies, on the one hand, children are still orphaned, families destroyed, from preventable disease, from malnutrition, from viral epidemics that sweep seemingly unchallenged across entire continents. With the knowledge of peace and how to create peace available to the largest populations ever recorded in our planet's history, we still witness the horrors of war, induced famine, senseless acts of hate, and we have to ask ourselves the question, why? Why are these things happening simultaneously? How can we have such wisdom when it comes to understanding the world around us on the one hand, and on the other hand, why does it appear that we lack the wisdom to apply what we know to end the suffering and to make the lives of our families and our communities and our global family that much better? Well, perhaps one of the answers to this question may come from a term that astronomer Carl Sagan coined before his death in 1996. Before he died, Sagan looked at our time in history and he looked at the uniqueness of the things that we're identifying right now. And what he said was, we are in fact living a very unique time of history. It's a time that he called technological adolescence. Technological adolescence, what a fascinating term. It's a term that implies there's something young about our understanding. What Sagan began to understand was that we as a species have reached a time where we have acquired the powers of creation, where we can tap into the forces of the universe on the one hand, and on the other hand, we are still learning the maturity and the wisdom of what it means to use that power responsibly in our lives. Sagan's question before he died was, will we survive our learning curve? Will we learn quick enough to gain the wisdom to survive the powers that we now have at our fingertips? One of our visionaries and one of the brilliant scientists of our time, Dr. Michio Kaku, co-author of the superstring theory, coined a beautiful quote a few years ago. He said, "For most of human history, we could only watch the beautiful dance of nature." He said, but today we're on the cusp of an epic-making transition from being what he called passive observers of nature to being active choreographers. If we are, in fact, the choreographers of technology and nature, as Michio Kaku suggests, then it gives even greater credibility to what Carl Sagan said about our time of technological adolescence. Is it possible that technology has grown faster in some respects than the wisdom of how we apply it in our lives? I invite you as a listener, just think about what has happened even in the last 50 years, the ability to engineer our genes, the way that we can now manipulate viruses and bacteria, nuclear energy, what it means to us and how we apply it in our lives. Do you ever get the feeling somehow that we've learned these things faster than we learn how to apply them or what they mean in our lives? Well, we have to ask ourselves, do we truly understand how these choices affect our world? Do we really know what they mean? Do we really have the wisdom to apply our newfound powers wisely in our world? To us today, from the ancients, we begin to understand that we are experiencing what some scholars call a broken chain of knowledge. There's a lineage of wisdom that extends for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of generations into our past. And what we know is that throughout time, that wisdom has been edited. It has been deleted. Portions of the information have been captured and stored in great libraries. Some of it has been lost as those libraries are destroyed. If we're to go back and look at this lineage of wisdom and what has happened through the ages, we can identify two key times in our history when the chain of knowledge that links our modern world with our ancient ancestors has been broken. Two great breaks in our chain of wisdom. And the first of those is what is called the Great Library of Alexandria. Now, I'm always amazed when I'm with live audiences and I ask people, I'll say, how many people have ever heard of the Library of Alexandria? And everybody raises their hand. And I say, how many know what was in that library? And rarely do I see more than 2 or 3 hands go up. We've heard of the library. We don't really know about what was in there, and I'm not surprised. The Great Library of Alexandria was destroyed by a fire from a civil war in 48 BC. It was created by the Greek Emperor Ptolemy I, and it was actually called a universal library, to the best of my knowledge. This is the first great library that was ever created for the sole purpose of preserving the information of human history from our very beginnings under one roof. The Emperor Ptolemy, he had the luxury of sending entire armies into all the known world, and their orders were to bring back a single copy of every text, every manuscript, every book that had ever been written, one copy to place into what was called the Universal Library to preserve the memory of mankind. Well, the library, as we said, was burned in the fire during the Civil War. However, before it was burned, the Roman historian Callimachus was given the job of cataloging what was in this library. And we do have Callimachus records, even though the library itself was destroyed. Callimachus documented in the Great Library of Alexandria over 400,000 scrolls that he described as mixed. And I had to investigate a little further to understand what a mixed scroll really means. A mixed scroll means that there were multiple authors contained on a single scroll. So over 400,000 mixed scrolls were in the Library of Alexandria. Over 90,000 additional scrolls were what he called unmixed, or scrolls of a single author, and an additional 42,000 scrolls that were not associated with any author at all, for a total of over 532,000 documents that were lost in that fire. And while we don't have the documents today, what Callimachus says to us is that included in those documents were some of the most ancient Hebraic documents, ancient Phoenician texts, Egyptian documents talking about the optics of ground glass and the medicines of Egypt. The entire Greek library was contained in the Library of Alexandria. What we know is when this fire burned the library and this information was lost, we know that we lost tremendous amounts of information, and that was one of the first breaks in the chain of wisdom. The second great break came during the religious persecutions after the crucifixion of Jesus. What we know is this, that in the 4th century, during the year 325 AD, the Western biblical texts as we see them today did not exist. There was no nice, neat biblical text compiled into a book the way that we see today. There was a loose assemblage of manuscripts and documents. Some of them were poorly written. Some of them were redundant. Some of them were so mystical that even the scholars of the time had no idea what they meant. And they said, well, if we don't understand them, no one will ever understand them, so we might as well throw these documents out. So what the best biblical scholars of today will acknowledge is that at its very best, our Western Bible is incomplete. Let me ask a question. If you're listening to this, you probably have had the opportunity to read at least a portion of our Western Bible. Have you ever felt like part of it was incomplete? You ever read the book of Genesis, for example? In the beginning, not much was happening, and all of a sudden, a lot of things were happening, and it happens in a single paragraph. Have you ever wondered why that is? Or where are all the women in the biblical text? We know that women were alive 2,000 years ago and beyond, and we know that some of them were literate and they could write. Where are their documents? Where are their texts? Well, the answer to these questions, and this is part of the value of going back into some of our most cherished traditions, is that we begin to recover documents that were edited and lost. And while what we have today is good, our Western Bible, it's a good text, it simply is incomplete. And the best biblical scholars will acknowledge that. What we know is that in the 4th century, in the year 325 AD, during what is known as the Council of Nicaea, at least 45 entire books were removed from our modern biblical text. 45 books were removed, and the ones that remained were condensed and rearranged into the story that we have today. So when we ask ourselves, where are all the women in the Bible? For example, we know of the books that were lost, there was an entire gospel of the birth of Mary. The birth of Mary describing her lineage as an Essene master and her being raised in a wisdom that supported the mystery and the understanding of our relationship to the forces of nature around us for health, for healing, for peace and survival. We know, for example, that there was not only one, there were 2 books describing the infancy of Jesus before he became the master as an adult. And to me, these books are fascinating. It's Infancy, Book 1, Infancy, Book 2. And they're fascinating to me because they describe a young male and they describe a young boy in ancient times coming to terms with a power that lives within his body that makes him so very, very different from the other children his age and what it means to him. There are stories, for example, in the book of infancy of Jesus, book 1, there's a story of Jesus playing with other children approximately his own age. And they're by a small stream, and they're fashioning small clay animals, small birds, out of the clay in the stream. And Jesus becomes frustrated, according to this text, because the animals are lifeless and they don't do anything. And he breathes life into these small clay animals, and they become animated, they become alive. And the other boys go home and tell their parents, and their parents get together with Jesus' parents and have a parent conference. And Jesus is helped to understand that he has powers and abilities that others do not have, and that there's a responsibility that comes with that. And from those kinds of stories, he learns that responsibility in his life. And for me, it makes him more accessible as a human, because he came into this world through the womb of a woman, and he came to terms with what his life meant to him, much the way we're asked to do today, through the trials and the challenges and the tribulations and the hurts and the joys of our lives. And without seeing these kinds of texts, we never get to understand that about the man Jesus. In the edited books of our Western Bible, there are an amazing series of documents, the letters of Herod and Pilate, a fascinating document. One of the great finds of the 20th century, what has been called the single greatest archaeological find of the last century, was found in an area that is known as the Qumran area along the shores of the Dead Sea, in caves above the shores of the Dead Sea, in clay vases that were still intact after thousands of years. There were a series of scrolls and documents and parchments that were found, and in those scrolls we began to find perhaps more information about our past and the most detailed information of our biblical history than we've ever found before. For listeners that may not be familiar with this find and what this find looks like, the library is called today the Dead Sea Scrolls Library. The library that we know today as Dead Sea Scrolls consists of parchments and documents that have been found strewn throughout a number of caves above the shores of the Dead Sea, and they're written on various kinds of medium. Some of the documents are actually written on animal hide, on parchment that has been rolled and preserved in the vases. The vases were actually covered with tar and pitch, and the lids were sealed to preserve and protect them from the elements over 1,500 years and 2,000 years and 2,500 years. Some of the documents are very intact. Some of them are scraps, no more the size than postage stamps. Some of the information was recorded upon papyrus paper, like the ancient Egyptians used, fragments of papyrus. Some of it was on lamb skin. Some of it was on cattle skin. Some of the information was preserved on very finely pounded sheets of copper, with the letters actually incised into the copper with a strong wooden stylus. All of this information, tremendous amounts of information, was recovered between 1946 and 1959 in 11 caves on the shores on the western side of the Dead Sea, just outside of Jerusalem. Between those years, over 25,000 fragments of this copper and papyrus and parchment were discovered, and it was eventually pieced into approximately 900 scrolls. And those 900 scrolls, the job of piecing the scrolls together and of translating them and compiling the information and publishing all of this, was given to a team of only 7 scholars. And there were 7 male scholars. And up until very recently, those 7 scholars were the only people that had access to this library of information that's now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls Library. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls Library has been very controversial and is in the news even today. The saga of the Dead Sea Scrolls is far from complete. One of the reasons that the library is so controversial is that it is within this library that we find the oldest recorded documents of the original books of the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew book of the Torah, which became the first 5 books of the Christian Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are the books of the Western Bible and of the Hebrew Torah. The scribes who penned the information in these scrolls placed them in the caves long before the edits of the 4th century ever happened. So that when these documents were discovered for the first time in a very, very long time, we actually saw the original words, the original text in the book of Genesis, and Exodus, and Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, as well as other books of our biblical texts that had never been found. Can you imagine what it would have been like to have been a scholar, 1946, 1947, a young scholar, working in the field and going into the caves and finding these texts and translating them, and all of a sudden realizing that you're looking at documents, at books of the Bible that had not been seen for over 1,700 years. What would you have done with that kind of information? And the answer is it was a very different world, 1946, 1947. We were just coming out of the war, out of World War II. And the answer at that time was, just don't tell anybody for a while. We kept them very, very quiet. And this is part of the saga and the mystery that goes along with the Dead Sea Scrolls, because so much of the information was reserved only for the scholars, and the general public really didn't have the opportunity to see many of the scrolls until as late as 1991. In 1991, through the efforts of modern-day scholars, the texts were actually freed up as microfiche and made available in the Huntington Library in Southern California for people to see today. However, it is going back into some of these original documents, and this is the value of going into these scrolls. It's because they begin to describe in the language of those who have come before us, in that original language, our relationship to the world around us and our relationship to the forces of our world. We know that tremendous amounts of information have been lost in the lineage of wisdom that links us with our past. The implications of that loss of wisdom are vast. Because today, many of our scientific principles, our spiritual understandings, the way we view medicine, our historic beliefs, as good as they are, and they are good, however, they are based in incomplete records. They're simply incomplete. Along with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the books of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the information that also I just shared earlier, there was another library that was discovered approximately the same time in history that picks up where the Dead Sea Scrolls leave off. The controversy of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that for the first time in a very long time, in almost 1,700 years, some of the books of the Dead Sea Scrolls showed us the information that was edited from our biblical text over 1,700 years ago. When the scrolls were discovered, those books were revealed for the first time in a very long time regarding the Old Testament only. Now, 1946, 1947, around the same time, the scrolls were being discovered. Another library called the Nag Hammadi, Hammadi, library was discovered in Egypt as well. Seeing the controversy of the scrolls, this library was immediately turned over to the authorities. It was translated and released in a very, very brief period of time. And the significance of the Nag Hammadi library is that it picks up where the Old Testament scrolls leave off, with the New Testament books that were edited during the 4th century, during the Nicene edits of the Emperor Constantine. And the Nag Hammadi library then goes even further with the New Testament traditions and many of the lost Gospels that we're only now beginning to understand. When we speak about prayer, what I know and I've learned from audiences over the last 18 years all over the world is that the word prayer means something very, very different to everyone. It's a very personal concept, and everyone has their own idea of how to pray and how they were taught to pray and what it means in their lives. So I'd like to begin this part of our program by simply saying there are no incorrect ways of praying. Every modality of prayer is valid. Every modality of prayer has its place. Every modality of prayer has its purpose. And among all of the different ways that we were taught to pray, there's a very good possibility that there are other ways of praying that are not commonly understood in the West. And as we can understand those and develop them in their lives, they become one more tool in our toolbox of prayers. And the opportunity then exists for us to apply an even greater number of prayers in our lives, in the lives of our children, our families, and our loved ones, as we understand what they do and how they work. So when we talk about prayer, my first question is, how do we pray? How do we pray in the West? When I was a young man, I began understanding that prayer, there are many, many different modalities of prayer, and Western prayer researchers have lumped the many and varied kinds of prayer into essentially 4 categories that I can share with you today. And this is one classification system. There may very well be other classification systems that we can look at differently. In this classification system, we're looking at 4 modes of prayer that Western science identifies today. They are colloquial prayers, ritual prayers, petitionary prayers, and meditative prayers. And I'd like to describe briefly just what each of those prayers means, or what I am intending when I use those terms, so that we're very clear on precisely where we're going with this material. Colloquial prayers are the informal kinds of prayers where we speak to God or the creative forces or the powers that be in our own words in moments when we feel we need it the most. I had a friend, for example, when I lived on the West Coast, who worked the night shift. And more than once or twice a month, my friend would share with me that coming home in the wee hours of the morning on the 680 freeway in the Bay Area, the little dial on the gas gauge began to drop dangerously low, and my friend would say a prayer, "Dear God, this one time, if you will please just let me get to the Texaco station at the next exit, I promise I will never let my gas tank get this low again." And then I'd hear about the same prayer again a week later. But this is an example of an informal or a colloquial kind of prayer. A ritual, a ritualistic prayer. And I'm amazed at how many audiences I speak with in the West are surprised when they see this word describing a prayer in the West, because they do not typically think of our prayers as ritualistic. They think of ritual as something that ancient or native or indigenous or aboriginal peoples are doing. Our lives are full of rituals, and our prayers are certainly no exception. So a ritualistic prayer is the kind of prayer that we use when we say a very specific set or form of words at a very specific time of day, at a very specific time of year. For example, at the evening meal, when we sit down with our families, God is great, God is good, let us thank Him for our food. That is a ritualistic prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep, saying those at bedtime, night after night after night. Those are rituals. So these are examples of ritualistic kinds of prayers. Petitionary kinds of prayers are prayers where we literally petition the powers that be for the good in our lives. There are teachings from around the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, where the force of God is identified as the I Am force, mighty I Am. In this moment, I claim abundance now and in all past, present, and future manifestations. This is an example of a petition to God for abundance in our lives. I claim the right to heal and to be healed now and in all past, present, future manifestations. So these are just simple examples of what a petitionary prayer might look like. Meditative prayer, and this is very controversial because for some people in some schools of thought, prayer and meditation cannot be used in the same sentence. They are so very, very different on the one hand. And on the other hand, there are overlapping similarities in very specific modalities. Certain kinds of prayer and meditation are so similar, it appears to be simply a matter of languaging and semantics. In meditative prayer, generally there are no words. In the meditation, we simply become aware of the presence that permeates the world around us and of us as being a part of that presence and part of all that we see. So while these definitions are certainly subject and open to interpretation and revision, I'm just sharing with you briefly and generally to give you some idea of what the 4 modalities of prayer are like that are typically acknowledged in the Western world today: colloquial, ritual, petitionary, meditative prayer.